In May 2020, a young woman in Barrow-in-Furness, Cumbria, posted a graphic account on Facebook. It detailed the years of abuse that she'd endured. The post, complete with photos of the serious injuries that she had suffered, rapidly went viral. These latest allegations actually followed earlier child exploitation scandals in the north of England, which increased racial tensions and incidences of hate crime at the time of even more heightened unrest because of COVID lockdown. However, as police investigated these latest allegations, they quickly discovered that everything wasn't as it seems. This is what happens when baseless lies and false accusations lead to trial by social media. This is the case of Eleanor Williams. Hi my lovelies, welcome back to my channel. Today's case is one that I followed since initially hearing about the actual charges, and it was well worth following because, whoa, the web of lies that we're going to talk about today is disconcerting, strange, and also begs a question about what's going on beneath a particular individual who claims that things have happened to them that haven't actually happened. I also want to make it clear that, of course, when it comes down to somebody claiming that they've been sexually violated, it's really important that we believe the victim, but we also have to be willing to acknowledge the evidence and at times realise that there are very rare individuals who make claims that are completely false and absolutely 100% fabricated. And the damage that the impact of those lies does to individuals who stand accused of heinous crimes is unfathomably damaging, and in the long term causes a whole host of psychological, social and emotional issues. So today's case is going to unpick that. I'm sure a lot of you will have your own thoughts and feelings about this. I would love to know how you think about this case and what your feelings are regarding what essentially prompted the individual to carry out the accusations that they made. Also, if you're new to my channel, I release my crime content on a Wednesday and a Sunday religiously. Crime and consistency is my theme. So if you always like to know where you are in life, then I am definitely a channel to subscribe to. Thanks to all of you coming back to support me. Amazingly big, huge, fantastic thanks to those of you who support me on YouTube and also on Patreon. The memberships that you actually subscribe to make a massive difference to this channel, so cheers! Let's go back, not too far, 20th of May 2020. You've got 22-year-old Eleanor Williams. Now, she's better known to people who are around her as Ellie. She goes ahead and posts this 1,300-word Facebook message. So it's a long message. And to say that it had serious ramifications is kind of playing it down. She basically posted this, and in her hometown of Barrow-in-Furness in Cumbria and beyond those areas, it just blew up hugely. So she posts this image of her face, and whoa, if you came across that Facebook post, you're going to be drawn in, because she has some shocking injuries. So very badly swollen eye, she had multiple bruises, she had a cut across her throat. So this is something that is very unusual to see on social media, and the moment that you notice that, it draws you in. Now in the post, she goes on to add that these injuries have been inflicted by 3 Asian men, that they'd taken her to various sex parties where she'd then been brutally violated by multiple Asian men. On top of this, she actually claimed that she'd been a victim of sex trafficking, a sex trafficking ring essentially, in Barrow-in-Furness, operating in the area that she lived for many, many years. She said that she'd been abused by Asian descent males at various locations in the north of England. Now, she reassured the people who followed her, and obviously the people who were then seeing this for the first time, who don't necessarily know her, but because it's being spread far and wide, that she's telling the police everything that she knew. And she wanted parents to essentially be aware of the danger. She wanted them to be warned against these predators living in the locality. And she also wanted children and young people to feel that they could voice any of the concerns that they had, or maybe the experiences that they'd also endured. So part of her post read this. This is the hardest post I've ever had to write. I didn't want to share this because I'm scared of the judgment that will come with it. It's why I kept quiet about what's been happening to me. But people have asked me to tell my story. When people have asked why I have a black eye or bruises, I've made up excuses, from falling over to banging on a door. Yesterday, I was put in the back of a car, taken to an address to have sex with 3 Asian men. Afterwards, I was beaten because I was in debt to these men for not attending parties for over 7 weeks due to coronavirus. The organisers of the party decided to beat me, to teach me a lesson. That's a shocking post. And if you're reading that, it's going to blow your mind that this young woman appears broken, brutalised, and really quite seriously injured, and is brave enough and courageous enough to share that story in a public forum, to speak her truth, as we so often are encouraged to do in this modern era. When you think about the timing of this, we also have to recognise that people at this point were still, and are still, in my area in particular, because we were affected very badly by this, they're reeling from other child exploitation scandals in the north of England. They happened a few years earlier. I've had personal experience of this issue, and I've worked in sexual exploitation, and I know how angry people feel about the huge failings of the police, the huge collusion of the services working against the girls who deserve to be cared for. That's a reality. There's still a lot of hostility and sadness, grief, and also mistrust towards services who essentially allowed this to continue, even in the wake of these girls consistently asking for help and saying that these things were happening to them. So this is a hot topic in the north of England, and certainly it's caused some social concerns and some social issues. So this is where, particularly in my area, there was a child sexual exploitation gang operating in Rochdale. Also, we've had Rotherham, and the reality is that the girls were speaking out for a long time and nothing happened, nothing changed. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, these services were genuinely as guilty to some degree in a lot of ways as the predators, who were enabled by their lack of care, compassion and consideration for these girls. Now, the reality was that this meant that, unfortunately, some people wanted to tar everyone with the same brush. And I understand why, because people have got this bias. Well, if we just say that everybody is guilty of that and we exclude that particular type of individual from our lives, we can be safe. Obviously, that makes no sense, but it's a predictable action. So unfortunately, because it was a particular ethnic group who were responsible for trafficking these girls, people started to feel that it was okay to be really offensive to everybody from that particular ethnicity and belief system, because in particular it was Muslim males. Now, even though we can say absolutely hand on heart that's not the correct action, like I said, there's a predictability to it. It's the way that humans interact and engage and act to try to protect those that are close to them, even though it doesn't make sense. When it comes down to her putting this out on social media, you know what happens straight away. All this is in the background burning. It's still in a place where people are struggling. And she puts that on Facebook, on social media, and it blows up. Absolutely blows up. And trial by social media begins instantly. Now, bear in mind, this is fueled on top by the fact that it's the height of first COVID lockdown. You've got a lot of people on furlough. You've got people with a lot more time on their hands. People are spending a huge amount of time on social media. So the eyes that might not have seen it usually are looking at it directly. So this is a perfect storm. Now, on top of this, you would imagine correctly that this is going to incite a particular type of political belief system. So individuals with, shall we say, far-right leanings, they took the opportunity to just go ahead and, as I say, tar everyone with the same brush. So they started to basically persecute members of the Asian community. And Asian homes were actually vandalized. So just because you were of Asian descent, people felt that that was enough of a reason to actually attack your homes. And one of the reasons for this is there was actually a list of people that were apparently allegedly complicit in the abuse that got circulated. So at this point, it's this vigilante behaviour. And I imagine that a lot of you can feel a level of sympathy and empathy with people who are vigilantes. You know, we see that happen. We've covered cases on this channel where people do things that are vigilante based, and sometimes people have quite a lot of empathy for why they did it. But what is problematic about vigilante behaviour is, firstly, there's no boundaries. Secondly, there's no level of controlling outcomes, because clearly people can go way over the top. And most importantly, 9 out of 10 times, they target the wrong people. So you've got these people just trying to get on with their lives, totally innocent, who are finding their homes damaged. Also, walls got daubed with racist slurs. Can you imagine how that is if you're a parent in that area? You're walking down the road, on either side, by the way. You could be white, black, Asian, doesn't matter. You can be Jewish, Christian, it's irrelevant. What you're seeing when you're walking down the road where racist slurs have actually been written is your child's going to be internalising that and thinking, why? And if you're somebody of that particular inclination, that's going to be reinforcing for the child, because you're going to be pointing it out and saying how you agree. If you're somebody who tries to bring in an understanding to your children's lives that diversity is an essential component of being in the Western world and there's so much to celebrate, you're going to have to diffuse those situations and explain to your child. And if you come from that particular ethnicity and you're seeing this hostility in your local area where you're meant to feel safe, that's going to be so psychologically traumatizing. So this is happening, and Asian businesses end up getting boycotted. People aren't going to do business there because they're blaming people just because they happen to be Asian. People put windows through, and people were actually verbally abused in the streets. To put this in context, there was one particular Muslim male who ended up getting chased in his street, and he ended up getting beer poured over his head. Now, we can all appreciate beer isn't the worst thing to have poured over your head, but let me tell you, if you are being chased and somebody throws a liquid over you, you don't know what that liquid is. It could be lighter fluid. It could be acid. The trauma of that moment of receiving that kind of assault, it's terrifying, and I imagine that he has terrifying moments every single day where there's that flashback of that experience, because that's what happens in these circumstances. So it really is becoming what I would say a serious situation where it can graduate and escalate to somebody getting really, really, really seriously hurt. So the police are obviously meant to be dealing with this, and people who are more leaning to the far right feel that it's not happening at a speed that they want. So they then start believing that there's this cover up and that actually the police are in on it as well. So we have tensions when it comes down to law and order. And we also have a mistrust now in the police because of prior situations where, with respect, sex trafficking was enabled, I would say, by the police forces in places like Rotherham and Rochdale, where things weren't challenged and people weren't dealt with because people didn't want to come across as racist, even though children were being raped. So I understand where it stems from, but it's completely mismatching to the actual reality, which I'll cover in depth today. These racial tensions, these previous sex scandals had increased. It kind of just gives that fuel to the fire with Williams' allegations. And actually, Tommy Robinson, so those of you who don't know who Tommy Robinson, he's a figure in the British press, so to speak, certainly in the British public. People have lots of different views about him, but basically he was the founder of the far-right English Defence League. And what I would say about Tommy Robinson is he's certainly a Marmite figure in the UK, so people either love him or hate him. There isn't a lot of neutrality around him. He is somebody who went to prison and was sent to prison for contempt of court. I will note that literally the sentence he got had never ever been heard of in the UK. So there's a lot of mistrust behind the sentencing and the fact that people believe that he was made an example of. And realistically, his main passion, it seemed, even though I would never agree with the English Defence League and I don't find their policies and belief systems at any point acceptable and credible to me, but he certainly had an issue around the safeguarding of children and the letting down of children. He felt very, very angry about the fact that people were calling out what he felt was highly inappropriate behaviour of these men who were indeed harming children. But he put himself out there in such a way that, like I said, he's become a bit of a individual who is either regarded as respected or absolutely hated. So wherever he goes, there is a trail often of, shall we say, conflict, because he stands for a certain thing that a lot of people don't stand for. Just trying to be neutral there, just trying to describe this character. I don't have an opinion at the end of the day. All I know is we're all on the same side, no matter what politics we have when it comes down to children being raped by grown men. We all agree on that, no matter what our politics. So he actually comes and visits the town. So you can see that this is how far that post has got. Now you have Tommy Robinson actually believing it and feeling that he's got to go and show his face because he's so anti the whole sex exploitation and failures around that. Now, Cumbria Police, and this is just such an example of why this is so dangerous that we're going to talk about today. They recorded 151 crimes just linked to Williams' post. Can you imagine? 151 crimes just linked to that post. Now that summer, that meant that hate crimes tripled in Barrow. And I understand the absolute passion that we all have for protecting children. I understand it. I'm the first person in the queue to condemn any of that stuff. But we're talking about no one's been found guilty. There's been no trial. There's absolutely no evidence aside from this post that any of what she said is real. And yet we're already 151 crimes in because of that post. And that is a sad indictment about how these kind of social contagions can cause great damage in our society. Also, because people are flipping generous, aren't they? I mean, we are. The UK is one of the most generous countries. I believe Northern Ireland is pretty much the most generous country. But at the end of the day, in the Western world, America, Australia, etc., we are generous when it comes down to charitable donations. And people start to donate money to a fund that's set up to support Williams and to go ahead and help prosecute her attackers. Now that, 100% up for. Doesn't matter whether she's guilty or innocent. Doesn't matter whether it's false or true. The point is, no one's going to get hurt by this kind of fundraising. So this goes out and they soon raised £22,000. And a Justice for Ellie campaign, it attracted more than 100,000 Facebook members. Have to tell you, that is one of the things that I absolutely love about the way that we can be as human beings. You know, we hate injustice. This is a peaceful way of acknowledging injustice. Like I said, there's been no trial. We don't know whether it's right or wrong, but it's something about the motivation we have in ourselves and within our souls to protect the vulnerable. And 100,000 people joining that because, you know, they wanted to make a difference. That says something positive, I would say. Also, it was such a popular page, it ends up having its own merchandise. So this merchandise features a purple elephant, and apparently that was her favourite animal. So arguably, again, merchandise can be really helpful because if you're raising money for charity, people actually can physically have something and you can donate the proceeds and so on and so forth. But this is gaining momentum. People are taking this super seriously. 100,000 people in a Facebook group is a lot. And also, the most important thing that it's saying is, we believe you, Ellie. Because like I said, one of the things that we always want where sexual violation is concerned is for the victim to be believed. And sadly, that means at times individuals can choose to exploit that good nature in the average human. Now, when that post went out on Facebook, this is basically the first interaction, the first engagement, the first knowledge that they have with Ellie and what had happened to Ellie. People are horrified by it, and rightfully so. But what Ellie Williams had actually not mentioned when she posted that message to Facebook was that just 8 weeks earlier, she'd been charged with multiple counts of perverting the course of justice. She was actually currently on bail when she posted that. And the reason that she was on bail is because she'd been making similar accusations. She'd made other very, very similar accusations against these guys over 3 years. So the previous 3 years had been busy for her. She had been accusing men falsely, consistently. Now, if people had known that, all the things that I've talked about so far, those 151 crimes, poor guy being chased and having beer put on him, the shops being robbed of business, the homes being vandalised, you can bet your bottom dollar none of what would have happened. None of it at all. Let's just take a minute before we kind of carry on looking at the crime to look at who Williams is. So she actually grew up on Walney Island in Barrow-in-Furness. Now, for those of you who don't know what Barrow-in-Furness is like, I actually used to call it, because I used to go to the Lake District a great deal, I also used to go when I was a very young kid to the zoo, not far from there, the Lakes Zoo. And Barrow-in-Furness always felt to me like I was coming to the end of the world. It's one of those places that's just on the coast and you arrive there and there's not really a lot to do. People are lovely, very close community, large industrial town. But I can also say there isn't huge amounts going on. So as a young person, it might be wonderful because of the community and everyone knowing you, but it might also be a little bit lackluster at times for things to do. It's actually had loads of recent modernisation, and the last time I was there, I actually really enjoyed walking around the actual town, but it's had its moments and it's had its problems economically. And like I said, growing up, I think that it will be one of those places that young people will actually want to stay or just get the hell out of because they want a bigger life. So it is one of those places that, like I said, for me as a kid, it felt like I got to the end of the world. Like I say, again, no offence to anybody living there, like one of the nicest groups of people, one of the loveliest communities, genuinely. But for young people, sometimes you have bigger aspirations to go elsewhere and it can be more difficult for employment. So you can get to a certain age, and this is where a lot of children and young people grow to have an exodus, essentially, from there. Now, she lived in a large stone-built semi. She lived on a quiet street. She lived with her mother, Alison Johnson, and her stepfather as well, and her older brother and her sister. And by all accounts, and I've looked into this deeply, so I do feel like I'm saying this with some reasonable evidence, she had a safe, secure childhood, certainly was loved, certainly was doted on, particularly by her elder siblings. And the family themselves, they were considered very well adjusted. They were pro-social. And that's said by the family, that's said by the people who were close to them and who knew them. Her mother, so Alison, she was actually a former Labour councillor for the town. So we're talking about somebody who stands for a particular belief system, is willing to fight for that, obviously has a morality potentially because of her beliefs and wanting to ensure people have a better life, because clearly when you get involved in politics in this kind of area in particular, that's your motivation. You care, you want to do good in the world. Her grandmother, Anne Burns, she'd actually represented the town's Hindpool ward on the Cumbria County Council, so clearly very motivated again on a social level. And she'd also served as a cabinet member for Children's Services. So she was known as really community minded, and so was her daughter. You know, these are individuals who were considered good-hearted, decent people. In fact, these are the kind of individuals that people look up to and want as mentors. So it feels really unusual when I start to describe Williams as an individual, when I compare and contextualize who she came from. I also want to make it clear, because I come down really hard on offenders, really hard, particularly predators. And I do not mince my words, and I do not hold back, and I do not care that some people find that difficult because I appear judgmental. I am judgmental. I own that. That's why I have a YouTube channel. Yes, I do my television programs, But at the end of the day, you come here, you come for me, raw. And I'm going to come down hard on people who deserve it. But I'm also aware that we have to think about, are there any psychological realities behind why this individual has ended up the way that they have ended up? And in spite of the fact that what I've just described regarding Williams and her family being solid, caring, loving, what I will know is that apparently, according to what I've learnt, Williams definitely suffered with her mental health during her childhood. Now, I don't know what these difficulties were. I've not been able to clarify that. What I can tell you is that she self-harmed from a very young age. Now, for those of us who understand self-harm, and this isn't to patronise you if you know, and I'm assuming that lots of you will know, it's more that if you don't really understand why people self-harm, I think it's always helpful to just kind of explain, in my opinion, and from my therapeutic working within this field, that people are not self-harming for attention. They're not self-harming because they want to frustrate you. They're self-harming because when they cut, first of all, the brain doesn't get the same feedback. So somebody who self-harms, it doesn't hurt in the same way it might hurt me. They have a pain threshold that works differently. And actually what we've seen is that there are often connections which mean that the brain soothes as opposed to notifies of the agony. So it should work that I cut myself on a protective mechanism. My body says, ow, stop that. It's why most of us would never do that. It's why when we hurt ourselves, we go, ow. But if you have a mechanism where emotionally you're in agony, and the agony is so intolerable, so challenging, so difficult, that you're looking for a way of minimizing that pain in the moment. And when you cut yourself or scratch yourself or do whatever your self-harm area is that you use to soothe yourself, it temporarily stops you having to manage that emotional pain by physicalizing it, but not to a degree where you can't manage the agony. So the emotional agony is more challenging than the physical agony, and actually the physical agony can at times feel more soothing. It's a way of deflecting. So when somebody is self-harming from a young age, they are in emotional agony. There is no doubt whatsoever. And I'm very sad that she was in a place and a position where she felt the need to harm herself early on. And I do not know what triggered that. I do understand that there'll be lots of theories about why people do end up harming. There are a lot of individuals who feel that trauma, in particular sexual trauma, can be a trigger for this kind of behaviour. I have also worked with harmers who have not had any of that in their history in early childhood. So it is not a clear-cut definite that you have to have had trauma in this way as a child, but just highlighting this is there in her childhood. So social services, they actually become involved with the family until she's 8 years of age. So social services end up being involved with the family until she's 8 years of age. So clearly there is some real concern. And also, I just want to highlight the fact that everyone's going to look as to why this individual ended up the way that she ended up. And it's easy to point blame at families. I mean, I do it often in these videos because damn right, there are reasons why families deserve blame. But in this case, we're looking at a very supported, structured family. We're also looking at the fact that they got social services involved with her. This is not a family afraid of external help and support. So I would say if you're going to go down a list of what makes a family an effective, supportive one, it's those that care only about providing respite and help and support for the people that they love. And clearly that's what her family have done. They've not been afraid to invite social services into the world. They've wanted what's best for this child, and clearly they embraced whatever support was given. According to her peers, the kids that she went to school with, they said that she was a little bit odd. She would behave relatively strangely at school. She was often absent from lessons. And as a teenager, we really start to see some problematic and challenging behaviour. The people who went to school with her peers, they say that she was somebody who acted very strangely. So she stood out because she didn't have typical behaviour. Also, it's worth noting that she was often absent for lessons. That may be because she was actually being allowed to stay off by her parent, but I would say to anybody who thinks that that's just poor parenting, that actually now, as opposed to even looking at these individuals as school refusers, they're more known as emotionally avoidant. So it's more of an emotional issue when they're not attending school. It's not just because they want to bunk off, but also it could be that she was absent from lessons because she chose not to go and her mum wasn't even aware of it. As a teenager, there's certainly a switch in her behaviour that's concerning. So she starts to smoke marijuana and she starts to take cocaine. Now, I think we've all been aware that when we're teenagers, some of us go down a certain path. Certainly, I cannot look back at my own childhood and adolescence and say I was squeaky clean. My adolescence was hazy in parts, but the idea of taking cocaine when I was a teenager, I mean, that was just so outside the realms of what I would have considered as appropriate. To me, cocaine was a yuppie drug. Yuppie, by the way, is if you were around in the 1980s, early 90s, and it was the people walking around with big mobile phones and being traders and making loads of money, and they were all feeding their habits by taking cocaine and being up to whatever hours trading, making loads of money on the stock market before crashing and becoming psychologically very unwell. But arguably, cocaine is something that you don't associate in a lot of childhoods, but she starts to take that, and that's a massive stimulant. When you have mental health issues as well, marijuana and cocaine, they are not going to be helpful. I appreciate that chemically organized, clinically developed marijuana can be used for things like depression, can be useful for a range of analgesics, but I'm saying street stuff, it's really strong, really powerful, often has high levels of THC, which causes things like paranoia. And cocaine is obviously a stimulant which can also do that. But she's clearly trying to manage something within her nature that needs some kind of self-medication. And the police would actually find her quite regularly. She'd be off her face, so high on drugs. She'd be alone, and also she'd be relatively far from home. And this is when she's young. Sometimes they'd find her injured. Sometimes they'd find her only partially dressed. Now, that certainly sets alarm bells off in my head, because even if she's choosing to do that to herself, that is, to me, suggesting there is some psychological distress. So she is dealing with something difficult, emotionally, psychologically, socially, probably all of those things together. And she is acting on this, whether she wants attention because she's in that distress, or indeed because she's found herself in that level of distress because she's exposed herself to things that she shouldn't have. And her mother, again, she's a good parent. She reports her missing 32 times. That's in 19 and 20, so 2019, 2020. So just think about that, 32 times. So we must have a high level of distress in the family as well, because this isn't a family who are just choosing to neglect her and say she's really awkward, she's frustrating, she's going off and doing these things, and kind of just accept that and let her be and just not inform the police. Obviously, mother is really concerned and thinks that she can come to harm, and so she's relentless at reporting these issues. Now just to take you back a little bit, November 2017, because remember, we started off by talking about 2020 where she does this Facebook post, but as I noted, what they were unaware at that moment in time was that she was already basically on bail. And let's go back to how this happened. So this is 2017, November. We've got a 16-year-old Williams. She goes to this house. It's a party that's on at home of Cameron Bibby. Cameron Bibby and several other people hanging out, being teenagers, doing what teenagers do. Now, during the course of that night, she got drunk. She smoked weed, and she actually ends up making herself sick. So she got very inebriated. I'm sure for those of you out there who have mixed cannabis and alcohol, you may have had a whitey occasionally and chuck your gups up. It's not a good mix. Obviously, she'd done that. She's young. She's a kid. She probably doesn't understand the limits. Now, Cameron ends up actually contacting her family. Her mother then goes there to take her daughter home. But in the end, even though that's what she'd intended to do, she later on takes her daughter to hospital. So her mother must have been really concerned about what had played out, maybe a bit suspicious about the state that her daughter was in. And it's at this point when Williams gets to hospital, she actually claims that she's raped by Cameron during that house party. This is taken incredibly seriously, as it should have been, and subsequently A videotaped interview is made by the police. So in this interview, she claimed a lot of things. She said that Cameron had kissed her, he'd watched her urinate, he'd commented on her pubic area, he'd touched her bottom, he'd sat on top of her, he'd exposed her breasts, he'd kissed her breasts, and then apparently he'd threatened to set his dog on her and also to bury her in the garden or to dump her in the sea. She then went ahead and showed text messages, so these screenshots that apparently had been shared between her and Cameron, which went ahead and corroborated her account. So you can imagine just how seriously her mother's taking this, the hospital have taken this, and certainly, and rightfully so, the investigators, the police have taken this. So Cameron at this point subsequently gets arrested. He's questioned by the police extensively. For 4 months, that young man lives with the possibility of being charged with an offence. Apart from in January 2018, Williams withdraws it. And at this point, the police confirm that they're not going to take the matter any further. So it took another 2 months after her withdrawing that complaint for them to police to say, actually, we're not going to go any further. Because remember, even if somebody withdraws the complaint, the police still have a right to go further with it. So even though a lot of people believe that somebody who accuses you can then withdraw that and then the deal is done, the case is over, in lots of domestic abuse situations, you'll find that the police will actually prosecute somebody who's guilty of a domestic abuse even if their partner has withdrawn the allegation. So this can happen, but he has to wait all this time. It must have been absolutely excruciating for him. Now, it turns out that the accusations against Cameron are 100% false. And even worse, those text communications between them, they'd been created by Williams. So she's showing these screenshots that are compelling, convincing, that understandably the investigators would believe made him bang to rights. And actually it turns out that it's her who sent them. Now, they didn't discover that until later on. So in the meantime, you just got to imagine how this is for Cameron. People are just pointing their fingers directly at him. He later went on to say, and I think we can all empathise with this, I certainly do, that it was the worst experience of his life. Now, after he was wrongly, falsely, totally inappropriate accused of being a rapist, he literally had to remove himself from social media. He never went back to Barrow Town Centre. He felt that he was constantly under suspicion. He was at fear of reprisals because he believed that it didn't matter that he was innocent, and he knew that he was innocent. There were other people out there who just felt that his character had been stained and there's no smoke without fire. He couldn't even pick up his own son from nursery. He was terrified about what people were saying about him. But this doesn't end it for Williams, no. Next, she's perfecting her story to some degree. She's perfecting the way to make false accusations. So she goes ahead and targets another man, a guy called Jordan Trengrove. This is in the 8th of March 2019. Just think about the time frame. It's a really quick time frame. This is when an 18-year-old Williams basically goes out with a group of people who Jordan is with. Like last time, she drinks heavily, she takes a lot of drugs, she's basically fully intoxicated. And then on the 6th of May 2019, she contacts the police. She says she's been attacked by Jordan. She said that he'd come to the flat that day, that he'd refused to leave, that he'd actually attacked her, threatened her with a lock knife. He'd then stripped her naked in her living room, pulled her into the bathroom by her hair before beating her up with the shower head. Then he'd raped her and he hadn't even used a condom. And during that whole experience, he threatened to kill her, said that he'd enjoy raping her. And she actually showed the police the injuries that she'd suffered. She got bruises to her legs. She got messages that had apparently, allegedly been sent by Jordan. Of course, absolutely 100% supporting her allegations. These graphic, lurid admissions, just boasting about what he'd done to her. Now, can you imagine being an investigator? Can you imagine being somebody in the CPS and you're finding out that this girl has been subjected to a torturous, brutal rape. And not just that, this guy's been sending her messages, basically laughing at her, boasting about it, showing pride. Wow, he is going to be considered a very violent, dangerous individual. An individual, certainly, who should not be walking the streets. So they're seeing this. And on top of this, Williams also claimed that she'd been raped by Jordan the actual night that they'd initially gone out in March. Now we're talking about 2 rapes that had happened. She said that he'd taken her to another address where she'd been raped, and then he'd taken her back to Barrow. These are the highest level serious allegations. Now at this point, Jordan's actually arrested, and then he is later released on police bail. But for this guy, this is far, and I mean far from over. Because on the 18th of May 2019, Williams once again contacts the police and says she arrives back from a night out. She'd allegedly left a door open because she was expecting a friend. But Jordan enters the house on that night. Uncannily, when she's left the door open for a friend to arrive, he makes his way in uninvited. She apparently had tried to make him leave, and then he just attacked her. He struck her about her head, her body. When she was on the floor, he had kissed her, and then he'd violently raped her. This time, apparently he'd worn a condom. And when the police turned up, obviously very concerned because they've let this guy out on bail, they find her naked, they find her injured. She's basically lying unconscious on the floor. This is every police officer's nightmare, that this predator that's been allowed out on bail is basically violating the very victim that they're meant to be protecting him from. So immediately, Jordan, he's arrested. But this time there's no bail. This time, Jordan is placed in custody, he's remanded to custody to basically await his trial date. That young man, he remained incarcerated for over 2 months. He even had to share a cell with a paedophile. Can you believe that? This guy is innocent of all charges, but he is sent to prison. He has to go through the indignity and the horror of being placed with a child molester, and he's only released after the charges are dropped on the 20th of August 2019. But that doesn't stop his house from being spray painted with the word rapist. That doesn't stop this man being abused by strangers in the street. Jordan became so isolated, so abandoned in lots of ways, so vilified, that in August 2020, that young man tried to kill himself. He was driven to a point and a place where he felt that the only way to escape the slurs, the only way to manage the abuse, was to snuff his own life out. That's what happened to Jordan. It's incomprehensible, the level of aggression and violence that, in this case, words and accusations can create. Because Jordan literally tried to murder himself. When his child was born, what happened? People weren't celebrating. People weren't congratulating. No, people were calling social services, flooding social services with calls, saying he was a rapist, saying he wasn't able to be around a baby because he wasn't safe. And don't get me wrong, listen, I understand that the reason that people call social services in a lot of circumstances is because they are good moral human beings. And who knows, those individuals motivated to do this may not have realised just how many lies have been told. I don't imagine they loudspeaker it everywhere that this guy has been falsely accused and they know 100% that that's the case. So instead, he's left with the slur and stain of this reputation that's so unfairly levied towards him. But the fact that there are so many calls, he would not have got a moment's peace. It's horrifying that we're talking about a young man who had even the most beautiful moment of his life stolen by this deception. He couldn't even enjoy the birth of his own child. Now, what I would say is that in this particular accusation, Williams had made some mistakes. So the police are starting to get suspicious. So first of all, they start to establish that the messages, remember the alleged admissions, shall we say, from Jordan, they had all been sent from an account created at Williams' family home. So the computer had used the IP address of the property's Wi-Fi network. So Jordan hadn't been there, had he? He hadn't gone into the house where her family lived, used the computer and sent him messages from there. That obviously is her. So at this point, they realise that all of the accusations that had been levied against Jordan, just like those against Cameron, were completely fabricated. Also, he hadn't ever been at the flat that day, nor had he been there during the prior alleged attack. And this is going to be so ironic when I tell you why they realise he hadn't been there during the prior alleged attack. He hadn't been there because he was in the back of a police car at the exact time he was alleged to have raped Williams. Yeah, he was with the boys in blue, literally in the car. Just going to say a little bit ironic. Also, how long would that have taken to check? Genuinely, this kid's in prison. This kid's having his life stolen from him. And one of the allegations, he's literally with the police themselves. He'd basically been picked up for arguing in the street. So that cleared up and clarified the fact that these are false accusations. Also, they realised that she'd caused every single one of the injuries to herself. Now that also does, in tandem, give us an insight to the kind of level and extent that she's prepared to go to support these lies that she is so desperate to tell to create this false narrative. Now, even though all of this is happening, the truth about what she's done, yeah, they don't get exposed until later down the line. So the damage that has been done to these young men is enormous, and no one's going out there having that conversation so that the local community doesn't believe that they have these potential rapists in their midst. It's like I said, have every empathy and sympathy with people who believe that there are predators on their row of houses or in their local area. We don't want them. Take them away, lock them away. I understand that. But these are innocent young men having their lives stolen, the best years of their lives stolen, because they should be enjoying themselves. They should be having those final freedoms before they grow into the adults that they're becoming. Now, during Jordan's incarceration, so when he's in prison, Williams ends up speaking to the police again. Of course she does, it's what she does. This is in June 2019. And she ends up telling Detective Inspector Nutter that she's been a victim of sex trafficking. She said that the sex trafficking began when she was around the age of 12 or 13, and that she'd been sold for sex parties. She also named one individual who she said she was responsible for this, who was the kingpin. And she said it was a local businessman and father who was 43-year-old Mohammed Ramzan. Now, I will tell you this. She'd done her research. So first of all, she thinks about ethnicity. I need somebody who looks at least Asian. Secondly, she thinks 12, 13. That tends to be the age frame that we see sex trafficking beginning. So when you look at individuals who coerce these young girls to basically do their bidding because they are vulnerable and also they feel indebted to these individuals, it tends to be around 12 years of age to 13 years of age. More vulnerable, the better. But certainly if you're going to create a facade of being abused by these human beings, that would fit the profile and paradigm that we'd expect. So she has done some homework as far as I'm concerned. So this father, Mohammed Ramzan, he's basically known as Mo Rami. This is somebody who now is in the frame. So once she's disclosed this abuse, she starts to talk about how horrific it was, that she'd been this pawn in this awful sex trafficking ring. She said that Mo had befriended her when she was 12. That's exactly what we see happening. We see these particular individuals looking for somebody who looks vulnerable, befriending them, being lovely to them, like being a best friend. Obviously, there's a total age frame issue, and those relationships are not obviously going to be authentic. What's a grown man doing, chatting to a kid of 12, etc. But for the kid of 12, they think they're being treated like a grown-up. They think somebody's being kind to them. These individuals will often give them mobile phones, they'll give them money, they'll give them cigarettes. They'll do things to make the child feel like they have an ally. And that's the beginning of that road. So she's playing that card. Oh, he befriended me when I was 12 years of age. Then he had sex with her. And then, of course, he manipulates her to go ahead and have sex with other men. That is how it works, with respect. I will acknowledge that. So like I said, some research has been done. Now, in the end, she said, this graduates. She ends up being taken to multiple locations. She's raped by multiple men, all of Asian descent. And she also says that these events were actually filmed and then they were sold. Now, all that happens, not going to die. All that happens. We've seen evidence of it. I've worked on cases like this. It does happen. So she is taking a narrative and she is forming and forging a story involving herself using the evidence that exists out there, that contextualizes and also fits in line with the expectations we have of these gangs. So according to Williams, this is all going on. She'd suffered this horrible abuse, but she'd also witnessed lots of other girls suffering exactly the same abuse. She said that on top of the fact that they were all anally and vaginally raped, there was also these really big, brutal beatings if they dared to be disobedient. She'd even apparently seen one girl set on by dogs because she'd been disobedient. Another girl had allegedly had a knife put into her vagina, a blade of the knife put in there, and she'd even been forced to have sex in spite of the fact it hadn't healed. And she'd, on top of this, said that Mo, this man who apparently was trafficking her and the kingpin in the group, he'd taken her to Amsterdam, and she'd therefore been forced to work in a brothel. We all appreciate that in Amsterdam, the red light district does enable a legal level of solicitation, but this is a story that even I, having worked in this area, find quite unusual, the idea that she'd been transported to Amsterdam to work in the red light district, so to speak. But this is the story that she's telling. She even said that she'd nearly been sold for 25,000 euros, but the deal had fallen through. I kid you not. This is literally what she's saying. She also claimed that she'd actually been kept as a sex slave in the UK for 2 weeks. She'd been kept in apparently a caravan. Here she'd been drugged with heroin, and then she'd had multiple men rape her. And Williams went on to claim that the abuse had been going on for years and years. And caveat, I just want to make it clear that when I am saying what seem to be astonishing claims, these are not actually that astonishing. The bit about Amsterdam and the being sold for 25,000 euros, I draw a line at that. In my experience, I've never had that historically when working with individuals who've been exploited, but every single thing I've just said about being exploited and the way that they work and also the kind of environments these girls end up in, all of those are absolutely in context with sexual exploitation. So even though we're talking about an astonishing case of false allegations, what she's saying as far as these gangs are concerned is actually completely in line. Like I say, she did her research without a shadow of a doubt. She even ends up giving this extensive list of names of both the victims and the traffickers. She even gave really detailed backgrounds about some of them. Again, at this point, I have to add in my thoughts about what is going on psychologically with her. Because on one level, it's incredibly callous. It has no consideration or care or compassion for the individual's lives that she's basically ruining, that she's putting at risk. But also, what is the subtext to these actions? She's giving lists of names that clearly they'll check. She's already in trouble, so to speak, for the false allegations that she's made prior to this. And she's certainly on thin ground regarding the police looking into this and realizing that she is lying. But for whatever reason, the drive to be at the center of something, to be seen, to be noticed, to have people pay attention to her, there is something so alluring and so necessary in her psyche that in spite of the grotesque damage she's doing to them and ultimately to herself, she carries on. Now, I'm sure that none of you are going to be surprised when I tell you that in spite of this new heap of new allegations, again, she's made a mistake, a big mistake. Because this is a young woman. She doesn't really understand investigations. She maybe comes from a place of belief that if you say something happens, then it's happened and the police are going to believe you, particularly in light of what we've talked about prior to this, which is the issues around sex trafficking and no one wanting a repeat of Rotherham and Rochdale. So the naivety could be one of the reasons that she messes up, but it could also be that she's not consequentially concerned. Whatever she's gaining from being at the centre of this storm is giving her enough impetus to continue. And because of that, she's really not paying that much attention to what she's saying and how easy it is to find her out. Because on top of what she said about Mo, who I'm just increasingly feeling so sorry for, because I'm talking about a man this happened to. This is somebody's life literally imploding because of this girl's lies. But she ends up spiralling this story and saying lots of bizarre things, including that Mo's taken her to Ibiza for 2 weeks. You all like Ibiza? Not necessarily the place that I imagine is the centre of sex trafficking. But apparently it is, according to Williams, because she said this is where she gets sexually exploited again. So allegedly, other men have paid Mo to have sex with her, and essentially Ibiza has been the place where this new kind of abuse has occurred. I'm not saying it can't happen like that. I'm saying in my experience, that's a new one for me. So officers go about checking travel records because clearly they need to, and they can see that it doesn't make any sense because at this point she ends up having to admit that she's lied, and subsequently they're able to see that Mo had never been to Ibiza. So in spite of this unfolding, and in spite of this obviously pointing to the fact that she's fabricating, she just kind of changes her story. So at a later trial, she just replaced this lie with another lie. And one of the things that did come out to be true is that fair enough, she did go to Amsterdam, but not quite with the sex traffickers. No, not quite, as you would expect when you think about what she's tried to get across. Instead, she actually went to Amsterdam with a sister and a sister's partner to celebrate her 18th birthday. Another few problems with that trip is that even if she had been being sex trafficked, it didn't seem to be that there'd be time for it because the group who'd gone remained together throughout the trip. They'd even all shared a hotel room at night, and during the day, they'd been with each other 24/7. There was no way that Mo had somehow attempted to sell her during the trip because there wasn't a window of opportunity. And I'm not really sure that sex traffickers work that way, that you're just allowed to go and have a jolly with your sister and chill out in Amsterdam while somebody is trying to figure out who's going to take you to the highest bidder. It's just not real, is it? And on top of that, at the end of the day, when Williams was in Netherlands, which they did have evidence of, Mo was in B&Q in Barrow. Not very transatlantic or romantic or that interesting. No, B&Q in Barrow, just going about his business. Also, if this isn't weighty enough evidence against her fabricating, you remember that list of 60 alleged victims, all of whom had apparently been trafficked, and also those on the list who were all perpetrators of this horrific crime? Well, they weren't sex traffickers, and quite a lot of them didn't exist. And the victims definitely weren't victims. But again, none of this is going to come out until later. And because none of this is getting advertised and the reality of her fabrication isn't known to the public, taking you back to that very first post that we talked about, it's going to be a big problem because people believe her. Now, bear in mind, when Williams tells Detective Inspector Nutter this, she's shocked and she's concerned and she wants to damn well believe her because she's not going to let the mistakes of the past play out again. And that's commendable because as a detective inspector, you will know about the public inquiry into Rotherham and Rochdale sex exploitation, and you're going to want to avoid that for your force. So she takes it really seriously, and she should. There is nothing against Detective Inspector Nutter for doing that. So this means that suddenly they start having these meetings of regional police forces. There's a major multi-force investigation launched. And understandably, because like I said, these pieces of the jigsaw have not been put together, it means that the inspector has triggered this for all the right reasons. It's obviously based on complete lies. But like I said, they fear that a child sex trafficking ring has basically been operating in Barrow-in-Furness for years. And that is something that they want to deal with. Williams, because like I said, the jigsaw pieces haven't been put together, she is considered to be a really serious threat. So police end up offering a safe house. She accepts a safe house. She actually ends up temporarily housed in a hotel just near Kendal police station. I don't know whether any of you know Kendal. I know it well. I know the police station as well. Very lovely place in the world. I do like Booth's supermarket there. I treat myself occasionally if I go on holiday near there. They actually went ahead to try to help her as much as possible by getting her a job as well. They arranged employment for her. And as you would expect, what does Williams do? Well, she sticks to type. She just starts to fabricate more and more evidence to support the lies that she's telling. So let's look at some of that, because again, it's bizarre and also very manipulative, and also identifies that she knows exactly what she's doing and that she has no care, compassion or consideration for the people that she's harming. So she starts sending sexual messages to lots of different male contacts on Snapchat. Also people that she met via dating sites and OnlyFans. She meets people that way as well. And she starts to manipulate the conversations that she's having just so she can get the type of replies that she wants. She wants seedy, sordid replies. And after she gets these, she alters the name of the senders to some of those who've been identified to the police as traffickers. So for example, one of them, she puts under the name Shaggy on a device. So police, in the end, they actually identify that it's just a teenager from Essex, and neither of them have ever met. But she took screenshots of those conversations to basically show the police that she was being pestered by members of this sex ring. She even sent herself messages posing as traffickers or trafficked girls. She actually had 6 different phones so that she could receive and send messages. Just imagine the amount of work that is going into this. This is a full-time job. But she knows that she's the person at the center of this. She has plenty of time to not do what she's doing, but she's so bought in, she's so allured by being seen as this victim, it's like she can't help herself. She also carries on with the fabricated injuries, so she's inflicting injuries on herself. She's writing in a diary all this false stuff because she's thinking that she's creating this foundation of evidence for her claims. She also wrote letters to herself. All of these, of course, claimed to have been sent from traffickers. We finally get to the 7th of July 2019, where these claims have been taken seriously. And the police end up arresting Mohammed Ramzan. Now bear in mind, this guy's been at B&Q, when he's meant to be sex trafficking her in Ibiza. But he gets arrested. Bear in mind, this happens in public, in view of everyone, just near his home on Promenade in Wilney Island. Can you imagine the shame that he would feel? He's a completely innocent guy, hasn't got a clue what's going on. And now he's been arrested in public. He was held in custody for 36 hours. Of course, he denies any wrongdoing whatsoever. He says he's not involved in a sex trafficking ring. It's the first thing you've ever heard of. And he's certainly not raped Williams. He had never even been alone in a room with her. He recalled that they may have met briefly once at a family party. That was it. He was so impacted by the false accusations, this man attempted to take his own life 2 weeks later in front of his own family. Can you imagine that? So now we have this man's life turned upside down, traumatized to a point where he no longer wants to be present in this world, and he does that, the unthinkable, in front of his own family. He tries to take his life. The trauma of that family and that poor man is indescribable. She did this to him. That's 2 men who may be dead because of these false accusations. Even after this poor victim had been told by the police they were not pursuing any further matters, they realised it was fabricated, it wasn't real what had happened as far as the accusations were concerned. For him, everything was real, because people start to abuse him. It continued constantly. The abuse was something he couldn't escape. It didn't matter that he'd been freed. It didn't matter that people in his local experience, his family, his friends would know that these were false allegations. The wider public didn't. They decided he was a sexual exploiter, and they felt they had a right to continue to abuse him. He had his windows of his car smashed, he had his tyres slashed, his family were verbally abused, he was verbally abused. They were forced to leave Barrow, where they lived, for several months at one stage. That man got over 500 death threats on social media. The windows of his rental properties, they were continually smashed. His tenants were driven out. He was called a pedo on the streets. This man had been a very successful pro-social individual who had been a great businessman. He'd contributed to Barrow. He was an individual to be proud of, before the accusations, of course. But because of them, his businesses were ruined. That man was left with virtually nothing. For what? For running into this girl at a party. Those sliding doors moments. That's all it took. She took his name. She lied about who he was. She lied about what he did. And she instrumentally and incrementally destroyed his life. And like I said, that almost cost him his life. On the 30th of June 2019, Williams isn't finished. She suddenly vanishes from this safe house in Kendal. Family and the police are obviously massively concerned for her safety. She's at a safe house. How she disappeared? They can't contact her. She isn't answering her phone. The police are able eventually to finally locate her in Preston. It's not far away. It takes about 25-30 minutes to get there. That's the following day. And they bring her home. Of course. She's not just popped to the Fishergate Centre. She's not been walking down Friargate in Preston. No. She ain't been shopping. No. Apparently, the traffickers had found her in Kendal. Because I don't know. Maybe she had one of those Apple tags on where they had a GPS. But yeah, they're pretty sophisticated, these particular traffickers. So at this point, she was apparently made to go to Blackpool, where Mohammed Ramzan, who we know is completely innocent, apparently he threatened to kill her. At this point, she'd been taken to 4 properties. She'd been brutally raped by all these different men. She even gave the police registration numbers of the cars that had driven her around. On top of that, she gave the address of a flat, which was above a takeaway where one of these attacks had occurred. As before, every single one of these things that she said was a lie. She'd actually gone to Blackpool, yes, that's true, but she'd gone of her own volition. And once she'd been there, she actually checked into a hotel. That's mostly where she stayed, to be fair. She didn't do a lot. She was caught on CCTV leaving by foot. Then she's actually seen on CCTV noting down a random car's registration on her phone. Also, she's caught taking note of the address that she gave, the one of the flat above the takeaway. She bought a pot noodle, went back to the hotel, and she watched YouTube videos. Like, that's actually how it played out. Again, she's not very sophisticated because genuinely there is a absolute CCTV consistent program of her doing all these things. So it's inescapable. This is all lies. She wasn't trafficked for sex by any point or by any stretch of the imagination. What I will say is, Blackpool again, good place to do your research because we've had some big problems in Blackpool when it comes down to sexual exploitation. So she's done her homework. This is a place where there has been problematic behaviour. She's not stupid when it comes down to finding the foundations and the building blocks to create this fabrication. Now, she got up late the next day, she'd set off to Preston, and that's basically when the police had picked her up. When she's faced with this absolute concrete evidence that she's been lying about her movements, Williams ends up saying, okay, I did lie. But she said, the reason that I lied was because if I hadn't have lied, the consequences by the traffickers would have been horrific. Basically, I have to do this to protect myself. Now, that shows what I would consider to be pathological lying. because there's no reason to lie anymore at this point. It's bang to rights. You've been caught. You've been found out. You've told such a web of lies that are so easy to identify. You may as well just come clean. But she can't. It's like second nature to her. She just tells another lie, hoping to cover up the other one. We all know what happens when you tell one lie, often it leads to another, and in the end, you're just shown to be totally deceptive. But for whatever reason, you've dug in deep and you don't want to acknowledge that the reality is hitting you in the face. And even though this has all happened, even though you would imagine by this point she's realised, listen, people realise that I am fabricating, this is going to come back and bite me on the ass. No. She just carries on this pattern of behaviour. So we get to the 18th of July, this is 2019, she disappears again for a second time. Again, no one can contact her. Remember, at this point, by the way, the police are still unaware that she's fabricated everything, okay? So this is a jigsaw puzzle. They haven't got all the pieces in place right now. So it's the early hours of the following morning of her disappearance. Her brother's girlfriend's driving through Barrow and she actually spots Williams. So at this point, she drives Williams to her flat. She informs her brother, who's obviously been very worried, and he immediately notifies the police. Again, evidence of a very caring, supportive family. Now, when the police arrive to do a check on Williams, she's literally semi-conscious and really injured. At this point, she says to the police, listen, this awful thing's happened to me. A day before you coming and finding me, a man called Salsa, he's assaulted me in my flat. He accused her of losing money by not attending sex parties. That's the ruse that she gives. Apparently during lockdown she should have been doing it. They're angry that she hasn't. And he tells her, you need to earn £10,000 because you've basically lost that £10,000. So at this point, he makes her take cocaine. He orders her to go to Leeds. And apparently here she's taken to another home. Here she has sex with two men. And she actually describes them being taken to properties in Headingley, Bramley, Bradford and Preston. So again, note the area she's going. It's kind of synonymous with some issues in sexual exploitation. She's done her research, I keep saying that, but she has. And of course, she's been raped at these properties by multiple men. And then she's finally allowed to return to Barrow-in-Furness. Salsa had met her at the train station and then driven her home. So these incredibly violent individuals are still allowing her to go home. But it doesn't quite end there. She doesn't get home safely because Salsa and another man, they then force their way into her flat and they rape her. Apparently, police had arrived just 10 minutes after that happened, but she couldn't recall anything further until she wakes up in hospital. So this is the story, that she's got no recollection, she just wakes up in hospital, and there are these things that are a complete blur. Now, of course, by now we all know that 2 and 2 is 4 and that Salsa is just an invention of her imagination. I imagine if she'd been given a little bit more time, she'd have known waltz, she'd have known samba, she'd have known a whole heap of others like cha-cha, for example. But of course, this is her just throwing names out there now. So on the day that she vanished, she'd actually caught a train to Leeds and then she'd spent most of the day in a park. Then she'd travel back to Preston. Now here, she actually had bumped into this guy called Oliver Gardner and apparently she'd had consensual sex with him in a back alley. I know, desperately romantic. But this had apparently been a chance encounter that had played out that way. He was walking home from a family party. I mean, what on earth, when it comes down to the universe giving you some bad luck, bumping into her on the way back from a family party and engaging in consensual sex? Little does he know how dangerous that is for him. After this encounter, shall we say, she catches a train back to Barrow-in-Furness. Now she's walking back to her flat and that's when her brother's girlfriend spots her. So the police are then, because of this time frame situation where the brother's girlfriend spotted her, able to trace CCTV, also look at mobile location, all the data that her phone gives them. And again, that means that they can trace the movements perfectly so that they know she's lying. Now again, the injuries that they see on her are all self-inflicted. And those messages, again, allegedly sent from another trafficked girl in Leeds, had been sent from one of her other phones. So this web is slowly closing in. One thing I will say though, that must have been terrifying for Oliver Gardner, was initially he's advised by police that he'd been accused of raping Williams. I mean, she's just absolutely relentless. This is another young man. Had consensual sex with this girl, like loads of boys would if he had the chance. And now he's up potentially for rape. Now, those false accusations, of course, are absolutely devastating for this young man. Had a severe detrimental effect on his mental health. He'd actually been studying for professional exams, but he couldn't continue his studies. That young man, down the line, attempted to take his own life. Three innocent men that she's almost murdered with her lies. And let's not make light of it. We can't underestimate it. We have to say it as it is. Those young men almost murdered themselves because of her lies. She drastically and devastatingly altered their course of their futures. It's all but unforgivable. It's only in March 2020, this is after a 2.5-year investigation by the police, that they actually had all the evidence they needed to prove that Williams had been lying all along. Bear in mind, when the police, who've painstakingly done this, bear in mind they were on her side, bear in mind they believed she was a victim, they'd done everything they could to help her, protect her. And now, when they have finally put all the pieces of the jigsaw together and they can present her with irrefutable evidence of those lies, Williams just carries on, insisting that everything she said is true. She literally refuses to accept reality. She just continues with this absolute fantasy. So she ends up getting charged with multiple counts, perverting the course of justice. This is relating to her false accusations against Cameron Bibby, Jordan Tengrove, Oliver Gardner, and Mohammed Ramzan. But in spite of this, which you would imagine is going to consequentially make her go, whoa, this is serious now, I'm in real trouble. This is going down a very, very dangerous road for me, for my freedom. As opposed to that pulling her up and making her realize that she needs to resist these impulses, no matter how powerful they are, it doesn't stop her. In fact, all it does is spur her on to manufacture even more evidence to support her false allegations. So we get to the 18th of May 2020. It's at 10:49 p.m. Officers basically find Williams. She's not at home. She's in a field. It's close to her home, but she's basically in a field. And whoa, she's badly injured. No doubt about that. Her eye is swollen shut. Her legs and her abdomen are literally completely covered in hammer marks, so hammer injuries that are horrible. Her little finger, partly severed at the tip. So she ends up telling the police, who are obviously very disturbed by what they found. This is a girl who's seriously injured. She said that she planned to catch a bus into Barrow, but apparently a man who was associated with this sexual exploitation ring had ran into her and offered her a lift. She'd accepted this apparently, and then he'd ended up taking her to a property where there were 10 men just waiting for her, even though they essentially bumped into each other and there hadn't been any organised agreement. But never mind, holes in the story don't seem to bother this girl. So after he picked her up, apparently takes her to this property, these men are there, they rape her multiple times. Also, one of the men had actually tried to cut off her little finger. And then after all this heinous stuff had happened and she'd been violently abused, apparently one of them just drops her off near her home, but she doesn't make it because she collapses in a field, and this is where the police finally find her. Now it's 2 days after that event. After, bear in mind, the police have spoken to her about all this fabrication, after it's clear they've got irrefutable evidence of her lies, in spite of all of this, 2 days after the police find her in that field, On the 20th of May 2020, she posts the pictures of her injuries. She posts a description of the alleged years of abuse. The thing that started this video. Yes, in spite of all of that stuff being discovered about her, she goes ahead and does it. And that sparks the far-right protests. It sparks the 151 incidents of violence and criminality. It literally turns the area on its head. People are devastated by this poor girl's injuries and they believe her story. Now, of course, the police know this is not true. So Williams is arrested shortly after making that post because part of her bail conditions was not to fabricate these lies. Now, when she's arrested, more demonstrations occur because people believe the victim and people think that what she said is true. It doesn't take the police long. They investigate this very effectively and they actually find a few days after this event the claw hammer. It's hidden against a fence in a field. This is just close to where the police had found her. It's got her DNA on it. It's got blood on it that belongs to her. Also, they're able to trace security footage and CCTV footage of her on buying the hammer, literally buying it. She bought it from Tesco earlier that month. She's banged to rights on every single level. On top of this, they get a pathologist to look at her injuries. Of course they do. They want to confirm whether these were self-inflicted or indeed inflicted by another person. And they say, look, this is not consistent with the account that she's told the police. They're absolutely consistent with being self-inflicted with a hammer. The hammer that she bought from Tesco. Don't get that on a meal deal. That's all I'm saying. Now, after Williams was arrested, the public outrage, the protests, they just get bigger. There's a massive state of unrest. This carries all the way through until August 2020. Can you imagine how you'd feel if you were being pinpointed as an individual that people weren't trusting because she's made up these lies? You're going to be in danger. It's terrifying for the people in the community. It's terrifying for everyone because people believe that there is a terrible thing happening in Barrow and people know that there isn't if they happen to be the individuals being accused. And this horrific collision is causing fear everywhere. Now, what makes this even worse is the police know this is all happening. They know that she's a liar. They know that people need to be told about this girl's fabrication. But they can't because the police cannot disclose details of the case against Williams because it will prejudice a future trial. They see all this horror playing out in front of them and there's nothing they can do about it. They have to be quiet. Williams ended up getting charged with 9 counts of perverting the course of justice. Now, she admitted to 1, but she denied the rest. So, of course, her case goes to trial. She's pleading not guilty. In December 2022, it's heard at Preston Crown Court. The prosecution produced what can only be described as damning evidence. I mean, let's be clear. Anyone who's got a slight interest in true crime would like to fight this case without having any qualifications because the evidence is so clearly damning that they were never going to lose. But hey, remember, she's dug deep in here. She doesn't want to admit reality, so she just hangs on to her fabrication. So they can contradict all of her accounts to the police, to pretty much anybody who's been involved in the case. The jury is seeing this. They see CCTV movements of her when it shows that she's at places that she pretended she wasn't and where she'd actually been seen buying a pot noodle when she's meant to be being raped by these men, where her mobile phone locations are. They can literally track and trace her down to the detail that's required to show that she's lied about all of these issues. The prosecution barrister actually compared her allegations of nearly being sold at auction in Amsterdam to Liam Neeson's film Taken. You remember that one? I've got a certain set of skills. I will find you and I will kill you. Not saying I sounded like Liam Neeson. Don't think it was a bad impression with respect. I've seen that film quite a lot of times. I will find you and I will kill you. And he does. Throwing it out there. Sorry, spoilers if you haven't seen that film. But bear in mind, it does sound like it's come from a plot of Taken without a shadow of a doubt. We get to the 3rd of January 2023. It takes 3.5 hours deliberation, which is nothing. Literally 3.5 hours deliberation means we got your card marked, kid. You're either definitely going innocent or definitely going guilty. There's no doubt at all. That means that they had decided really early on that she was guilty as hell. They find her guilty on every single count. And on the 14th of March 2023, Williams gets sentenced to 8.5 years in prison. She'll be eligible, to be fair, for parole after serving just half of her sentence. Doesn't seem a lot, does it? 4 years. She almost killed 3 men. God knows the long-term damage that she's done to them and their family. She stole moments that were precious when a new father wasn't able to enjoy his new child, when another father felt like his life was so lackluster in living because of the claims that she'd made that he even tried to kill himself in front of his family.
By way of very broad summary, this defendant made serious allegations of a sexual nature against a large number of men between the October of 2017 and March 2020. Of course, I've considered whether the aberrant nature of these offences means that I should assume that the defendant is suffering from some mental impairment. There is no explanation for why the defendant would commit these offences. She has gone to extraordinary lengths to create false accusations, including causing herself significant injury. No explanation for this behaviour is apparent. However, that does not mean that I should speculate. Unless and until the defendant chooses to say why she has told these lies, we will not know. This offence is fact-specific. Previous cases are of little assistance. When considering culpability, I must take account of the seriousness of the underlying offence. I bear in mind the nature of the deceptive conduct and the time over which it continued. I consider whether the offence casts suspicion on others, whether others were arrested. In this case, I'm asked to consider community impact. I'll set out in detail my approach in this regard. In relation to all counts, I bear in mind that these were allegations of sexual offences. These carry not only the risk of prosecution, but also a potentially indelible stain on the character and reputation of everyone accused. Sexual allegations, even where disproved, often leave the falsely accused person living under a general and misplaced suspicion.
This is an individual who got 4 years, essentially, when you break it down, because if she serves half a sentence and she behaves well and she says she's remorseful, there's a strong possibility she'll be walking our streets in 4 years. Now, despite Williams' conviction, which we can all agree is correct, many of us may think that her sentence is not long enough, her family continue to be the support they've always been. They fully support her. Her mother, Alison, well, she acknowledges that her daughter made up some of the allegations. I mean, come on, Alison. Alison, you seem like you're a good mother. You seem like you're a caring human being. You're clearly somebody who's politically motivated and you've tried to make changes to your community for the better. I'm sure you have done all of those things. But she's guilty. And if you provide support for her, if you minimise her responsibility, all you're going to do is create a psychological position where she can do this again. You have to make it clear to her that what she's done is wrong, and you have to acknowledge her guilt. If you don't that, you're essentially applying a potential narcissism further to her personality. She thinks that she just made up some of the allegations, but she says, as far as she's concerned, she was definitely a victim of a sex trafficking ring. I understand why she may want to play that card, because at the end of the day, it's almost unbearable and indescribable and horrific to imagine that you've created a human being who could cause such destruction, who could willfully destroy lives. It's almost easier to believe there's been a miscarriage of justice and she really is a victim. She also adds to this to support her belief that her daughter was sex trafficked, because she said that she was the subject of a national referral mechanism. That's an NRM order. And apparently this was because she'd been trafficked for sex from the age of 12. But I will tell you that it's very possible that she was given an NRM because she managed to lie and suggest that she had been trafficked, just like she lied and said that she'd been trafficked from that point onwards. I mean, Alison says that the truth is that people just don't know the whole story about her daughter and that they'd think differently if they did. Arguably, I'll say this, to people who maybe are erring on the side of Alison and believe there must be something awful that happened to this girl to end up this way. The defence's job, when they're defending you in court, is to bring out anything mitigating as far as circumstances are concerned. If the defence barrister has a mitigating circumstance, it will be on record. I don't see that on record. I don't see there being any evidence to mitigate what she does. And it's easy to say, if you really knew the whole story, you'd understand. But I don't think we would. I don't think any story can legislate, legitimise or minimise the actions of what this girl has done. Also, to date, the family have actually failed to pay back the $22,000, which was donated by those original well-wishers, which was all about supporting Williams and supporting her prosecuting these non-existent abusers. Apparently there's this dispute as to which charities the money will now go to. I'm not, by the way, saying that her family are trying to keep hold of that for ill-gotten gains, so to speak. I'm just saying that there is some contentious issues around this money per se at the moment. To date, Williams, who has done what I can only describe as the most immoral, unthinkable crime and caused such absolute poignant distress, permanent trauma to the individuals that she's accused, she's expressed absolutely no remorse for her crimes. In fact, she's just dug deeper. She's claimed that every single thing that she told the police was true. Was true. Not an apology. Not an I realised, not I was wrong. Just a, hey, everything I said is right. In spite of all your evidence, in spite of the CCTV, in spite of me buying a pot noodle, having a pot noodle in my hotel room, all on video essentially, making it clear that everything I said is a lie. In spite of the hammer that I bought and then used on myself, in spite of all that, no. It's all true because in my head, I want it to be true. That's how she wants to hold on to this fantasy, because that's what she is. She's an absolute fantasist. I think what's difficult with this case is that there's a bit of me that wants to go, come on, she has to have a mental illness. She has to have a mental illness of sorts. There's something going on. But I'll tell you, it's unclear. And I have to say it's unclear because of the reports that have been done. So forensic psychiatrists who basically assessed Williams multiple times, because bear in mind she kept saying that all the horrible things had happened to her, they diagnosed her with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And apparently they suspected this was because it originated from undisclosed sexual abuse in her childhood. And they said that Williams displayed the key symptoms. So she had suicidal ideation, she had substance misuse, and these fit in, of course, with having a traumatised past. However, two further psychiatric evaluations haven't identified any mental illness. I will say that the judge said that it couldn't be ruled out. She could possibly be suffering from one. She hasn't actually given any explanation for her actions to date. So she's not said, this is why I think I did it. There's been none of those explanations. I guess that a lot of us will be thinking, potentially, I say a lot of us, I think this potentially, but I think a lot of you will as well. It sounds like it could be diagnosed as a form of Munchausen's. So she needed the attention, she needed the focus. It was a way of making herself visible. But again, I have no diagnosis for that. And some people don't believe that factitious disorder actually even exists, that at the end of the day, she was an individual who just enjoyed attention and was willing to cast others to the side to achieve that. A little bit like somebody who becomes dependent on drugs, dependent on alcohol, dependent on gambling. It's a way of medicating a life that they feel dissatisfied with. What's really frustrating for me about this case is because sexual exploitation happens. Girls in particular, white girls, Sikh girls are another group who've been horribly sexually exploited. They are individuals who genuinely live through this hell. They go through the horrific things that she described. And cases like this one that she's created, that she's fabricated, it detracts the real attention. It detracts the real police resources that are required away from the victims of child exploitation. And charities have actually come out and said, you know what, this case has made victims really reluctant to come forward because now they're scared that if they come forward, they're going to end up getting arrested and prosecuted like Williams. So they're actually thinking, wow, it doesn't matter that mine is my truth. I could end up in prison like she is. Also, in Barrow, the hate crimes and the levels of hate crime have not returned to pre-2020 levels. So the ramifications of Williams' actions, they believe that they are going to be felt for years and years and years to come. And it's so frustrating because this false accusation, this false fantasy that she's created, it is so devastatingly distressing for people who've actually been victims. And the idea that there is a kid out there right now being horribly sexually exploited by these kind of gangs is too terrified to actually tell the truth, to speak their truth, to speak to the police for fear of reprisals against them, for fear they're ending up in prison for telling the truth, that she caused that damage. It is unforgivable. I feel frustration with her family. I think they're supportive. I think they tried their best, but I think that by not making her be called to account and take full responsibility for her actions, they are just perpetuating a mindset that is incredibly dangerous, incredibly destructive, and actually has the power to kill. 3 men almost took their lives because of her lies. And I think her sentence is low, and I wonder whether a man doing something similar to this may not find themselves with such a lenient sentencing. I would love to know your thoughts. I really wanted to cover this case because it's something close to my heart, but also because it just shows you that there are some individuals in the world around us who are willing to go to lengths, extraordinary lengths, to allow themselves the gratification of attention, even if it costs and devastates other people's lives. Let me know your thoughts. Please get in touch with your own feelings about this. Are you as angry as I am? Do you know people who've been affected by sexual exploitation? Are you somebody who has experienced racism and abuse because people feel legitimized by these kind of cases? And if so, how has that made you feel and how have you overcome it? Leave me a comment, get in touch, and as ever, thank you so much for joining me. I hope I've covered this case in depth. I hope you found it interesting. And as I said, the one thing that we can see is there is only one villain in this piece. And that villain, no matter what her background, is Eleanor Williams. Be safe, guys. Take care.